Imagine yourself living in the heart of medieval Europe, perhaps in a small stone village or within the wooden walls of a bustling market town. The air smells faintly of smoke from the hearths, and you hear the distant toll of a church bell, calling the faithful to prayer. Life here is ruled by two forces that seem absolute: the church and tradition. For a woman, these forces do not just shape the rhythm of daily life. They dictate how she is allowed to feel, behave, and even think about her own desires. Medieval society was built upon rigid hierarchies and expectations. At the top were kings, lords, and the clergy, while peasants and laborers made up the majority of the population. But even within these layers, women had their own distinct set of rules, to follow rules that were often invisible but deeply felt. A woman's body was considered not her own. It was seen as a vessel of honor for her family, a symbol of virtue, or a potential source of sin, depending on who was looking. From birth, a girl's life was mapped out. Her future would most likely involve marriage, arranged not out of affection, but for alliances, property, or survival. Romantic love, as we imagine it today, was rarely the foundation of marriage. Instead, the union of a man and woman was a social contract. The church often described women as needing guidance, painting them as more likely to succumb to temptation. This attitude seeped into laws, customs, and everyday life. For a woman to show any sign of personal enjoyment or attraction outside the expectations of her husband or, even before marriage, was dangerous. Gossip spread quickly, and a reputation was everything. A single rumor could destroy a young woman's chances of marrying, which often meant the difference between a stable life and one of poverty. Villagers whispered about behavior that did not seem proper, and women were expected to behave modestly, speak softly, and avoid any hint of boldness in how they dressed or acted. The church played a powerful role in defining what was considered virtue. Religious teachings told women that they should remain pure before marriage and be entirely devoted to their husband afterward. Women were frequently reminded that the first woman, Eve, had brought sin into the world through temptation. This story was used as a warning. Women were considered capable of leading men astray and, therefore, needed to be carefully controlled. Even simple things like laughter in the wrong setting, dancing, or enjoying a conversation with an unmarried man could be Medieval law codes also reflected this mindset. In many regions, a woman's worth was legally tied to her chastity. If she was accused of misconduct, her testimony might be dismissed simply because she was seen as less trustworthy than men. Punishments for women accused of improper behavior could be severe. While men might face fines or temporary shame, women could be ostracized, beaten, or forced into humiliating public confessions. Of course, not every woman lived under the same conditions. The rules varied depending on where you were in Europe and whether you were a peasant, a merchant's daughter, or a noble woman. Wealthier women had more material comfort, but they were still subject to intense scrutiny. A noblewoman's marriage was often arranged to strengthen political ties, and her behavior was expected to reflect the honor of her entire family. If she dared to defy these expectations, the consequences could ripple far beyond her own life. One of the strangest aspects of medieval thought about women was how natural desires were seen as something shameful or dangerous. Medical texts of the time, written mostly by men, often described women as having uncontrollable passions that needed to be subdued. These texts mix superstition with flawed understanding of the human body, suggesting that women were naturally weaker, both physically and morally. Doctors and clerics warned that women who were too independent or too forward were a threat to social order. This constant policing of behavior created a culture of fear and silence. Many women likely felt torn between their natural feelings and the demands of a society that viewed those feelings with suspicion. Even within marriage, where desire was technically allowed, women were expected to prioritize their husband's needs above their own. It wasn't about love or connection as much as fulfilling a duty. But history is never as simple as the rules written in books or preached in churches. Beneath the surface, women found ways to express themselves and to live fuller lives than the strict codes suggested. Some women used subtle forms of resistance, choosing when to smile, when to flirt, or when to speak their mind, even if it risked a raised eyebrow. In towns and villages, there were always stories of women who did entirely follow the script. A merchant's wife who quietly conducted her own trade, or a widow who managed her property with confidence despite the murmurs of neighbors. There were also the courtesans and entertainers who, while living on the fringes of respectability, wielded a certain kind of power. Though society judged them harshly, they were often better educated, more worldly, and more financially independent than many noblewomen. Their lives were a paradox, condemned in public, yet privately admired or sought after by powerful men. The medieval idea of rules for women was not just about morality, it was about control. By dictating how women should act and think, the ruling classes and the church maintained order. A woman who was quiet, obedient, and modest was less likely to challenge authority. Yet, even in this world of constraints, women's voices and experiences cannot be entirely erased. Through letters, poems, and stories passed down through generations, we catch glimpses of women who felt deeply, who loved, and who lived complex lives despite the limits placed on them. Imagine, for a moment, being one of those women. You walk through the marketplace, your head covered by a simple veil. You keep your eyes lowered, not because you lack curiosity, but because a wandering gaze might be noticed. A passing conversation might turn to who you are, where you come from, and whether you are good or proper. Even when you are silent, people form opinions. In such a world, even small acts like singing while you work, or choosing a brighter color for your dress carry meaning. As we dive deeper into this history, the question becomes clear. How much of what we know about women's lives in the Middle Ages is shaped by the voices of men who wrote the laws, sermons, and chronicles? How many stories of women's courage, humor, and quiet defiance have been lost because they were not considered worth recording? And most importantly, what did it truly feel like to be a woman living under these invisible rules, constantly balancing between being seen as virtuous and being judged as improper? The expectations placed on medieval women were not just enforced by religious leaders and lawmakers, but were woven into the very fabric of everyday life. From the moment a girl was born, her future was largely predetermined. Her education, if she had one at all, revolved around domestic duties and moral instruction. A noble girl might be taught to embroider, read religious texts, or manage household accounts, while a peasant girl would learn to cook over a smoky fire, tend animals, and spin wool. Very little of this education encouraged her to understand or embrace her own feelings. Instead, the focus was on obedience, humility, and service. Marriage and control. Marriage was seen as the central point of a woman's existence. A young woman was expected to marry as soon as she reached an age deemed suitable by her family, which could be as early as 12 or 13 among the nobility. Marriages were arranged by families, often without the girl's consent. Her role was not to find love or happiness, but to secure alliances or wealth for her kin. In this environment, the concept of personal attraction or pleasure was rarely considered important. Once married, a woman's identity was often swallowed by that of her husband. In legal terms, many medieval cultures considered a wife to be part of her husband's property. Her ability to own land, control money, or make decisions was heavily restricted. While widows sometimes regained a measure of independence, they were still scrutinized for their choices, especially if they decided to remarry. The church reinforced these expectations by teaching that a woman's role was to obey her husband as if he were her spiritual guardian. Priests often spoke of the wife's duty in marriage, framing intimacy as something that was less about connection and more about fulfilling obligations. The concept of a woman openly enjoying intimacy or pursuing her own desires was viewed as scandalous and even sinful. Gossip and reputation in a close-knit medieval community. Gossip was powerful. A single careless remark could mark a woman as improper or wild, labels that were difficult to shake. If a woman laughed too loudly in public, spoke with confidence, or seemed friendly with a man who wasn't her husband, whispers would start. These rumors weren't just idle talk, they could lead to real consequences, such as being shunned by neighbors or accused of immorality. The weight of reputation meant that women were constantly aware of how they presented themselves. Clothing was carefully chosen to avoid appearing too bold. A simple ribbon in the hair, a flash of bright fabric, or a confident stride could invite unwanted attention. For noble women, the stakes were even higher. Their every action was observed and judged, not only by their immediate family, but by entire courts of attendants and advisors. The church's teachings on women's desire. The medieval church had a complex and often contradictory stance on women's feelings and body. On one hand, religious texts celebrated the Virgin Mary as the ultimate example of purity and virtue. On the other, they viewed ordinary women as deeply flawed, easily tempted, and responsible for leading men into sin. Sermons often reminded congregations of Eve's role in the fall of man, suggesting that women were inherently dangerous if not controlled. Religious scholars debated how women should behave, with some even writing detailed guides on how to manage a wife as supposed unruly emotions. Confession became a tool for control, as women were encouraged to disclose even their private thoughts to priests. Through confession, the church learned of the personal struggles and desires that women faced, and these confessions often reinforced the notion that such feelings were shameful. Interestingly, some medieval medical theories suggested that women were naturally more passionate than men, which was seen as a weakness. These beliefs were often based on ancient texts by Greek and Roman physicians, which were misinterpreted and combined with Christian teachings. As a result, the natural emotional and physical needs of women were treated as something to suppress, not understand. The double standard it is. Important to remember that the rules around women's conduct were not applied equally to men. A man's reputation could withstand far more scandal than a woman's, while women were punished or shamed for any perceived impropriety. Men who engaged in questionable behavior often faced little consequence. In some cases, a man's wildness was even celebrated as a sign of strength over. This double standard made life especially difficult for women who wanted to live authentically or express themselves. For women of the lower classes, survival often required bending these rules. A peasant wife might take on roles traditionally reserved for men, such as managing farm work or negotiating at markets, simply because it was necessary. While these women were less scrutinized than noble women, they still risked being judged if they appeared too independent or assertive. The quiet resistance of women. Despite the heavy weight of social expectations, women found small ways to resist and assert their individuality. Some turned to writing or storytelling, passing down tales that reflected their experiences and hopes. Others formed close-knit groups with other women, sharing wisdom and providing emotional support. Folk songs, household recipes, and herbal remedies were often handed down through generations of women, becoming subtle acts of independence and knowledge. There were also women who defied societal norms entirely. Some joined religious orders not out of devotion but to escape marriage and gain a degree of autonomy. In convents, women could become educated, manage property, and even write. While nuns were still under the authority of the church, they often enjoyed more intellectual and personal freedom than many of their married counterparts. Then there were the traveling women, those who became midwives, healers, or merchants. These women walked a fine line between respect and suspicion. Their knowledge of herbs and healing sometimes brought them wealth and admiration, but it also made them targets during times of fear or superstition, as accusations of witchcraft were never far behind. The fear of being misunderstood in this world of unspoken rules and silent judgments. The fear of being misunderstood shaped how women lived. Even the simplest actions were scrutinized. If a woman smiled at a stranger, was it an act of kindness, or was she being too forward? If she chose not to marry, was she pious or suspiciously strange? These questions were not just idle speculation. They could determine a woman's future. The line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior was real. A noble woman might be praised for her beauty and grace one day, and condemned for being too proud the next. A peasant woman might be admired for her hard work, but scorned if she seemed too independent. It was an exhausting cycle of appearances, expectations, and unspoken fears. Even within the safety of their homes, women were reminded of their roles. Household manuals and religious texts emphasized obedience, quietness, and to desire more, to seek affection, joy, or personal fulfillment was often seen as selfish or even sinful. An unresolved question yet. For all the strict rules and whispered warnings, history shows us that women were never simply passive. They lived, loved, and found ways to leave their mark, even if their stories were rarely recorded. As we look back on this period, we are left to wonder, how many women quietly defied these rules, living lives of hidden courage that we will never fully know. By the time we reach the later centuries of the Middle Ages, the rules governing women's behavior had become so deeply ingrained that they almost seemed natural. Generations of women had grown up hearing the same lessons repeated by mothers, priests, and elders. Be modest, be obedient, and never draw attention to yourself. Yet the world was slowly changing. Trade routes expanded, cities grew, and new ideas began to spread, quietly challenging the rigid structures of medieval life. Despite this, most women still lived under the weight of social judgment. A woman's life was a delicate balancing act between appearing virtuous and simply surviving. Even small acts of self-expression could be risky. For example, a widow who refused to remarry might be praised for her piety, but if she displayed too much independence, perhaps running her household with confidence or managing her own business, she could be viewed with suspicion. The idea that a woman could live for herself, free of male oversight, unsettled many women in literature and art. The stories and art of the time reveal how society viewed women. Courtly love poems, written mostly by men, often portrayed women as distant and idealized figures, pure objects of admiration, rather than real people with emotions and desires. In these tales, a lady was admired from afar, placed on a pedestal, but rarely allowed to act on her own feelings. This romanticized image masked the reality that many women's voices were excluded from these narratives altogether. However, a few women managed to break through these constraints. Writers like Christine de Pizan, a French poet of the late medieval period, challenged the negative stereotypes of women. In her famous work, The Book of the City of Lady, she built a metaphorical city where women's achievements were celebrated, countering the male-dominated histories that painted women as weak or sinful. Her words offered a rare glimpse into how a medieval woman might think about her place in the world, and how unfair the rules could be, punishment and social order. The control over women's behavior was often maintained through fear. A woman accused of stepping outside her expected role could face both legal and social punishments. While not every accusation led to public humiliation or physical punishment, even the threat of being labeled immoral was enough to silence many. Some communities held public shaming rituals for women accused of impropriety. This could include being paraded through the streets, forced to wear humiliating clothing, or subjected to verbal abuse. Though these punishments were harsh, they served as a warning to others about the cost of defiance. It wasn't just about the individual womanite. It was about reinforcing the larger system that kept women's roles strictly defined. The role of religion in shaping desire. Religion was both a source of comfort and a tool of control. For many women, faith provided a sense of purpose and belonging, but it also came with strict boundaries. The church preached that a woman's body was sacred only when used for marriage and childbearing. Anything outside of that, any sign of enjoying her own feelings or asserting independence. Confession, which became a common practice in the Middle Ages, gave priests a powerful window into the personal lives of women. Through confession, women were urged to view even their private thoughts as potential sins. This often created a cycle of guilt. However, not all religious experiences were about control. Some women found spiritual freedom in religious orders. Nuns and abbesses sometimes wielded significant influence, running convents that were centers of learning, charity, and culture. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composer, and writer, showed that women could be both deeply spiritual and intellectually powerful. Everyday life behind closed doors. While the rules were harsh, Day-to-day life was not always as bleak as official records suggest. Within the walls of their homes, women found moments of joy and companionship. Friendships among women were a lifeline, offering a safe space where they could share their thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment. These quiet bonds were built around common tasks: kneading dough, sewing garments, or caring for children. Folk traditions and herbal knowledge were also passed down among women. These practices were often a source of healing, both physically and emotionally. Though they were sometimes dismissed as women's magic, they formed an important part of community life. The sharing of remedies, recipes, and stories created a kind of hidden strength among women, even in times when they were outwardly a hidden power. It would be wrong to imagine that medieval women had no influence at all. While they were often restricted, they also found ways to shape the world around them. A wife could quietly guide her husband's decisions. A mother could instill values in her children, and a skilled midwife or healer could become indispensable to an entire village. In noble courts, some women became powerful advisors. Even if their influence was hidden behind a man's title, queens and noble ladies could sponsor artists, arrange marriages, and even broker peace between feuding families. Their influence might not always be recorded in history books, but it was felt in the decisions that shaped kingdoms and communities. Looking back, when we study the lives of women in the Middle Ages, we see a mix of oppression and resilience. The rules were harsh, but they were not unbreakable. Women found quiet ways to resist, to express themselves, and to live with dignity despite the constraints. Today, we might wonder, how many of these rules were truly followed? Did every woman in medieval Europe accept these expectations? Or did some simply pretend, while living their own truth behind closed doors? It's a question we can never fully answer, but it invites us to think about how history is written and whose voices are heard. A final reflection. The story of women in the Middle Ages is not just about silence and control. It is also about survival, creativity, and courage. Though their names are often lost to history, their lives shaped the world in countless unseen ways. As we move forward, we might ask ourselves, what lessons can we take from their quiet strength? And how can we honor the voices that history tried to forget? In the quiet stone chapels and wooden confession booths of medieval Europe, a world of whispered fears and forbidden secrets unfolded. For many women, confession was not simply a spiritual duty. It was a deeply personal ritual, a place where the weight of expectations and unspoken rules pressed heavily on their shoulders. The church taught that salvation required purity and the admission of sins. Yet what was considered sinful often overlapped with the most private and human aspects of a woman's life. Imagine standing in line for confession, your head covered with a simple veil, feeling the chill of the stone floor beneath your feet. The air is heavy, with a scent of candle wax and incense. Behind you, other villagers wait in silence, each holding their own small burdens of guilt or fear. When your turn comes, you step inside the wooden booth, where the priest's voice is calm but distant. He asks you to reveal your thoughts, your actions, and your doubts, things you may never have spoken aloud before. For women, these confessions often revolved around the smallest of matters, because even a modest expression of independence or curiosity could be viewed as suspect. The church's teachings about women, yes, behavior, were rooted in the belief that women were inherently fragile and more likely to fall into temptation. This idea, passed down from biblical stories like that of Eve, painted women as both vulnerable and dangerous. As a result, a woman's thoughts about love, attraction, or even a fleeting moment of joy could feel like a heavy secret to be purged through confession. There was a quiet fear that failing to confess such thoughts might not only harm the soul, but also bring shame to the family and community. Confession was meant to bring forgiveness, but for some women, it was also a tool of surveillance. Through these private conversations, priests gained insight into their lives, their fears, and their private struggles. This knowledge reinforced the power of the church and its ability to shape how women behave. A woman might leave the booth feeling lighter, but also more aware of the invisible boundaries that defined her life. Beyond confession, the punishments for women accused of improper behavior were severe and public. If a woman was accused of stepping outside the expectations of virtue, her life could unravel quickly. Gossip was often the first weapon. A neighbor's careless words, a merchant's suspicious glance, or even the envy of another woman could spark whispers that spread like wildfire. Once a rumor took hold, proving innocence was almost impossible. In many medieval towns, public shaming was used as a way to reinforce social order. A woman accused of disobedience or impropriety could be made to stand in the town square, wearing a sign of her supposed misdeeds, or subjected to verbal insults from her neighbors. In some cases, women were paraded through the streets, their hair cut short as a symbol of disgrace. Though these punishments might not always involve physical harm, the humiliation could be devastating. There were also legal consequences. Laws regarding women's behavior varied from region to region, but they often treated women far more harshly than men. In some cases, a woman accused of adultery could face fines, imprisonment, or worse, while a male counterpart might escape with little more than a warning. These double standards reinforced the idea that women were the moral backbone of society. Any misstep on their part was seen as a greater threat to the community's stability. Yet behind the strict rules and harsh punishments, women carried secrets that history rarely records. Many of these secrets were not grand acts of rebellion, but small, quiet moments of defiance. A woman might secretly keep a letter from someone she cared for, hide a ribbon in a color considered too bold, or choose to smile at someone she wasn't supposed to. These small acts, though seemingly trivial, were ways of holding on to a sense of self in a world that sought to control every aspect of their lives. The life of a medieval woman was full of unspoken rules. She was expected to be modest in dress, soft in speech, and diligent in her household duties. Even her thoughts were expected to be pure and devoted to her family and faith. But being human meant that thoughts and feelings did not always follow rules. A glance, a moment of curiosity, or a passing daydream could leave her feeling conflicted, wondering if she had sinned in ways she did not fully understand. Consider the story of a young woman in a small village who was rumored to have been too friendly with a traveling merchant. Perhaps all she did was smile at him in the marketplace, or pause to ask about goods from distant lands. But in a community where everyone watches everyone else, that small moment could be twisted into something scandalous. Soon, the whispers grow louder, and she finds herself standing before the local priest, forced to confess not just her actions, but also her intentions, as though even the flicker of a thought must be weighed and judged. For women of higher status, the rules were different but equally suffocating. A noblewoman might live in a grand castle with fine clothing and servants, but her every move was watched by courtiers, servants, and family members. A misplaced glance, a private letter, or a rumor whispered in the wrong ear could lead to disgrace. Unlike peasant women, who might quietly endure gossip in their village, a noblewoman's reputation could affect the power and alliances of entire families. A single scandal could destroy carefully arranged marriages or political plans. Some women, aware of how fragile their reputations were, learned to live carefully and cautiously. They spoke softly, avoided unnecessary conversations with men, and presented themselves as models of piety. Others, however, found ways to bend the rules. A few women discovered that by carefully managing gossip, they could turn it to their advantage. A whispered rumor could distract from another secret, or a well-timed act of generosity could silence critics. Even within this strict environment, there were places where women's voices found expression. Folk songs, for example, often contained hidden messages about love, longing, and hardship. While these songs might seem simple, they carried stories that women could not openly tell. A mother might sing a lullaby to a child that included subtle lessons about survival, caution, and hope. A group of women gathering to work might hum tunes that hinted at their shared struggles and quiet dreams. There is something deeply human about the way women of the Middle Ages balanced the weight of public judgment with their private selves. They were not simply victims of the system. Though the system was harsh, there were also survivors, finding ways to live within or just outside the boundaries that were drawn for them. Yet, we must ask ourselves, How many women's lives were changed or even destroyed by the simple act of being misunderstood? How many secrets were buried, never told, because speaking them aloud would bring ruin? In a world where reputation was everything, women often walked through life with an unspoken caution, aware that any small act could be magnified into scandal. A simple conversation with a stranger could become the seed of a damaging story. A laugh at the wrong time could be interpreted as a sign of loose morals. It was not enough to live a good life. One also had to appear to live correctly in the eyes of neighbors, priests, and family members. The smallest whispers of doubt could snowball into accusations, and once those whispers began, they were nearly impossible to silence. Consider how gossip worked in a medieval village. Houses were close together. Doors rarely had locks, and the market square served as the heart of all daily life. People observed one another constantly, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes as a form of entertainment. If a woman stayed out too late, someone would comment. If she seemed too cheerful while speaking to a man who wasn't her husband, someone would notice. This was especially true in rural communities, where life moved slowly, and every small detail of behavior seemed to matter. Confession played a strange role in this cycle of judgment. While the church presented confession as a sacred opportunity for forgiveness, it also became a source of fear. Women were encouraged to tell every detail of their private thoughts to priests, yet doing so sometimes placed them under closer watch. A priest who believed a woman was too bold or too curious might instruct her husband or family to monitor her more closely. There was a sense that a woman's thoughts needed to be policed, as though her private feelings were not entirely her own. This atmosphere led to a culture of self. Many women learned to hide their thoughts, even from those they trusted. Their true opinions or desires were tucked away like secret treasures, shared only with a sister, a mother, or a close friend. Some women found solace in these quiet confidences, while others carried their secrets like heavy stones, afraid that speaking them aloud would invite punishment or shame. In towns and villages across Europe, punishment for women who stepped outside expected roles could be both harsh and humiliating. Public shaming was a common tool. Women might be made to sit on a cucking stool by the village pond, exposed to mocking laughter, or thrown into the water as part of their humiliation. Others were forced to wear symbolic clothing or rough garment, a sign, or even a paper hat, declaring their supposed offenses. These punishments were not just about correcting behavior. They were designed to remind every other woman of the consequences of stepping out of line. It is worth noting that these punishments often had less to do with the severity of an act, and more to do with control. A man who behaved inappropriately might face mild consequences, but a woman who did the same would bear the full weight of communal outrage. The unspoken rule was that women were responsible not just for their behavior, but for the moral fabric of the community. If something went wrong, if there was a scandal, if someone fell ill, if crops failed, women were often the first to be blamed. Among noble families, punishment took different forms. A noble woman who broke social expectations might not be paraded through the streets, but her disgrace could be equally devastating. She might be sent away to a convent, cut off from her family, and stripped of her inheritance. Her name could be erased from records, or spoken only in whispers. For a woman of high birth, honor was everything, and once that honor was questioned, her future could collapse. Yet, despite the dangers, women found ways to keep their secrets safe. Many developed a kind of quiet intelligence, learning how to navigate conversations carefully, how to say just enough, but never too much. Some women became skilled at redirecting gossip, planting small, harmless stories to distract from more personal truths. Others learned to live in the gray areas of society, neither fully obedient nor openly rebellious, but always watchful, always calculated. There are also moments of unexpected solidarity among women. While gossip could be cruel, it could also create bonds. Women shared advice, comfort, and warnings. A friend might whisper about which priest was kind, and which one liked to pry too deeply in confession. A neighbor might cover for a young woman who needed to avoid unwanted attention. These networks of quiet support helped women survive a system designed to limit them. Even within the church itself, Some women navigated the rules with subtle skill. Nuns and abbesses often acted as confidants, hearing the worries of wives, daughters, and widows who had no one else to trust. While the church officially upheld strict teachings, these women of faith sometimes offered compassion and understanding that went beyond doctrine. In their letters and writings, we find rare glimpses of women acknowledging the hardships of being judged for feelings that were entirely natural. There was a strange contradiction in medieval society. Women were both feared and admired. They were celebrated for their roles as mothers, wives, and caretakers, yet constantly warned against stepping beyond those roles. A woman who displayed confidence or independence could be labeled dangerous, while one who was too quiet or withdrawn might be seen as hiding something. There was no perfect way to exist in such a system. Every choice carried the risk of judgment. Imagine, for a moment, a young woman preparing to enter confession. She kneels before the booth, her hands trembling slightly as she considers what to say. Does she admit to the thoughts she had while watching the night ride past the village? Does she speak of the anger she felt when her father dismissed her opinion at the dinner table? Or does she stay silent, choosing instead to confess something trivial to avoid drawing suspicion? These decisions were not small. In a society where the soul was believed to be at constant risk, even a private thought could feel like a heavy burden. And yet, despite the fear and the rigid expectations, women endured. They carried their secrets quietly, protecting not just themselves, but also the small joys. They could find moments of laughter with friends, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with their hands, the simple pleasure of a song hummed while working. These moments were never recorded in chronicles or official histories, but they were real and they mattered. How many of these untold stories were buried with the women who lived them? How many secrets faded into silence because no one thought they were worth preserving? If you walk through a medieval village at sunset, you might see the traces of a life where secrets were hidden behind calm smiles and lowered eyes. The women who lived there carried untold stories of longing, frustration, and quiet defiance that would never be written down. They were expected to move through life with a grace that left no trace, as though their thoughts and feelings were insignificant compared to the needs of their families, their husbands, or their communities. Yet behind closed doors, a different world existed, one filled with whispers, laughter, and private confessions that were too fragile to survive public scrutiny. In some ways, the act of confessing, whether to a priest, a trusted friend, or even silently in prayer, was both a burden and a relief. The church taught that confession was a path to forgiveness, but for many women, it was also a reminder of how closely they were watched. A priest might ask questions that cut too deeply, pressing for details about thoughts or feelings that were never meant to be spoken aloud. In these moments, a woman might wonder whether confession was truly about saving her soul, or about maintaining the church's grip on her life. Some found ways to navigate this system. Some women offered carefully chosen words in confession, admitting to minor faults while keeping their deeper feelings hidden. They understood that silence could be a form of protection. Others found freedom in small acts of rebellion that no one could see. A poem scribbled on a scrap of parchment, a glance exchanged with someone they could never openly love, a memory cherished in secret. The punishments for women who were accused of improper behavior were not always physical, but they were designed to cut deep into the spirit. Being shamed publicly was one of the harshest penalties. A woman paraded through her village with her head uncovered, forced to endure the jeers of neighbors, would carry that humiliation for years. In some towns, a woman accused of gossip or disobedience might be placed on a wooden stool and dunked into a cold pond, her soaked clothing clinging to her as the crowd mocked her. These acts were less about justice and more about creating fear, a warning to every other woman to stay within the boundaries of expectation. Yet there were moments when women turned this fear into strength. A humiliated woman might quietly rebuild her life, forming alliances with other women who would face similar judgment. These small communities of mutual support, often invisible to men, became powerful networks where advice, food, and kindness were shared. They were not formal groups, but they were lifelines, offering comfort in a world that so often denied women any power of their own. In the upper ranks of society, secrets and punishments played out in different ways. A noble woman who stepped outside her prescribed role might not be dunked in a pond or mocked by villagers, but her life could still be destroyed through isolation and silence. She might be sent to live in a remote convent, her name removed from court records, her story rewritten to preserve her family's reputation. While some noble women found a strange kind of freedom in convent life, where they could read, write, and think without the constant pressure of courtly appearance, as others felt trapped, longing for a life that was entirely out of reach. Among both peasants and nobles, secrecy became an essential skill. Women learned how to conceal their feelings, how to navigate conversations without revealing too much. They learned when to nod, when to smile, and when to let silence speak for them. It wasn't that they lacked thoughts or feelings. Rather, they learned to keep them hidden, knowing the risks of being too open. Over time, these habits became second nature, a quiet language of survival. Still, some women dared to be bold. Some became healers or midwives, roles that gave them a certain respect, but also drew suspicion. Their knowledge of herbs and medicine, passed down through generations, made them valuable to their communities. Yet when fear or superstition took hold, these same women could be accused of witchcraft, their healing skills twisted into evidence of supposed dark powers. It was a dangerous path, one that required courage and resilience. When we look back at this time, it is easy to focus on the rules and punishments, but the true story is more complex. It is about the ways women found to endure, to adapt, and to keep their spirits alive, despite the constraints placed on them. Their resilience is visible not in grand acts of rebellion, but in the small details: a mother teaching her daughter a song filled with hidden meaning, a group of women laughing together while spinning wool, a quiet friendship that lasted a lifetime. These small, private acts were powerful precisely because they were invisible. They allowed women to claim moments of joy and connection in a world that tried to control every aspect of their lives. Though history has often ignored these stories, they shaped the reality of medieval life just as much as the kings, wars, and grand events recorded in chronicles. We might wonder, how many of these secrets remain buried forever? How many moments of courage, kindness, or quiet defiance vanished without a trace, simply because they belonged to women whose voices were never considered important enough to preserve? And yet, even without written records, there is a sense that these stories live on in the songs that survive, in the fragments of letters, in the traditions quietly passed from mother to daughter. In the end, the confessions, punishments, and secrets of medieval women remind us of something universal, that even under the heaviest restrictions, people find ways to hold on to their humanity. They find moments of truth and beauty, even if they can share them only in whispers or glances. The medieval church was more than just a place of worship. It was a powerful institution that dictated nearly every aspect of life, including how men and women interacted, married, and even thought about their own private feelings. For women, this control was especially strong. The church not only influenced their daily routines, but also reached into the most personal corners of their lives, shaping how they understood love, marriage, and their own body. It created a framework where personal feelings were often seen as something to be regulated, confessed, and kept within rigid boundaries. Imagine living in a small medieval village, where the church bells ring each morning and evening, marking the rhythm of daily life. The priest's voice carries authority not just in matters of faith, but in decisions that shape family, community, and the rules of proper conduct. A woman's life was guided by these teachings from the moment she was born. Her worth was often measured by her purity and her obedience, and anything outside of those boundaries was seen as dangerous or sinful. The church's teachings about women were influenced by centuries of religious interpretation. Stories like that of Eve were used to remind women that they were the ones who could lead men astray. This belief was so deeply rooted that women were often viewed as naturally weaker, needing guidance and control. As a result, women were taught to see their own feelings as something to be wary of, something that needed to be hidden or confessed. Marriage as defined by the church, was not about love or personal happiness. It was a contract, a duty, and a sacred bond meant to serve the greater good of the family and the community. Women were taught that their role was to serve their husbands, bear children, and remain faithful, while men were given greater freedom, even within marriage. A woman's feelings were expected to be secondary to her obligations. She was told to obey her husband as she would obey the church itself, with no room to openly express her own needs or desires. Priests often preached about the dangers of female independence. A woman who was too outspoken, too curious, or too confident was seen as a threat to the social order. Her behavior might be called sinful, not because it harmed anyone, but because it challenged the idea that women should remain quiet and obedient. The church's influence was so strong that even in private, women learned to monitor their thoughts, fearing that even a moment of personal longing or pleasure could be a mark of sin. Confession became one of the main tools the church used to maintain control. Women were expected to share their most private thoughts with priests, to admit to feelings or actions that might be seen as improper. But confession was not always a safe space. It was a reminder that their lives were under constant watch, both by their neighbors and by the church itself. What might have been a natural part of life was turned into something that required permission, forgiveness, and often guilt. In some communities, priests and church officials even regulated when couples could be together. Certain days of the week or times of the year were declared off, particularly during religious festivals or fasting seasons. For women, this meant that their lives were not only shaped by social expectation, but also by a calendar of rules that left little room for personal freedom. This interference was not just spiritual. It affected marriages, families, and even the ability to form genuine connections. The church also controlled how women dressed, spoke, and behaved in public. Modesty was expected at all times, and any hint of boldness or attraction was considered inappropriate. A woman who dressed in colors that were too bright or fabrics that were too fine might be accused of vanity, even if her choices were innocent. Priests gave sermons warning women not to tempt men, placing the responsibility of moral order squarely on their shoulders. Yet, despite these restrictions, women found small ways to hold on to their individuality. A mother might whisper advice to her daughter about how to navigate the church's rules without losing herself completely. A young wife might quietly decide how to balance her duties with the moments of affection and joy that were possible in her own marriage. Though these acts were invisible to the outside world, they were forms of quiet reminders that women were not simply passive followers of the church's commands. At the same time, the church's teachings about sin and virtue often created an impossible standard. Women were expected to be pure and obedient, but also to bear children and maintain their home. They were told to avoid any sign of pride or pleasure, yet they were praised for being beautiful or gentle. The contradictions were difficult to navigate, and many women must have felt trapped between what they felt inside and what they were allowed to express. Imagine being a young woman hearing these sermons every week, being told that even your thoughts could condemn you. If they were not pure enough, you might find yourself second-guessing every smile, every word, and every gesture, wondering if it was somehow wrong. In a world where men had greater freedom and authority, women learned to move carefully, speaking softly and avoiding anything that might invite unwanted attention. The church's power was not absolute, but it was deeply felt. It shaped how families were formed, how communities operated, and how women understood their place in the world. Yet we have to wonder, how many women quietly questioned these rules? How many found ways to live on their own terms, even if only in the smallest, most hidden ways? The deeper you look into medieval life, the more you see how the church's influence was not only public, but also deeply personal, reaching into the private thoughts and daily rhythms of women's lives. Every aspect of life was framed around religious rules: when to work, when to rest, what to eat, and even how to think about family and marriage. For women, this meant living under a constant expectation of virtue, with the church's teachings acting as both a guide and a form of control. Priests often gave detailed instructions to couples about what was acceptable in marriage, While men could sometimes bend the rules without consequence, women were constantly reminded that they were the guardians of purity and morality. They were expected to remain modest and selfless, to obey their husbands as they would obey God, and to avoid any behavior that might be considered indulgent or prideful. Even within marriage, a woman's feelings were often dismissed as unimportant. She was told her primary role was to bear children and serve her family, not to seek personal fulfillment. In some cases, the church even set rules about when a married couple could be together. There were restrictions during Lent, Advent, and other holy seasons. Certain days of the week were off limits, and there were guidelines for what was considered proper conduct. These rules were presented as necessary for spiritual purity, but they also reinforced the idea that a woman's personal feelings were secondary to religious duty. Imagine being a young wife who barely knew her husband, trying to navigate these rules while also learning how to be part of his household. There was little space for affection or tenderness, when everything was bound by obligation and fear of judgment. For unmarried women, the scrutiny was even greater. A single woman who was seen spending too much time with a man, even in innocent conversation, could find herself the subject of gossip. Her reputation could be damaged in a matter of hours, and once her reputation was tarnished, it was almost impossible to restore. This fear of being judged pushed women to live quietly, always aware of who might be watching and what others might say. Confession added another layer of tension. Women were encouraged to reveal their thoughts and actions to priests, but this was not always a comforting experience. Priests were often strict, asking probing questions and reminding women of the importance of remaining pure and obedient. Some women may have found relief in confession, using it as a way to unburden themselves. But for others, it was simply another reminder of the control the church held over their lives. It reinforced the feeling that their private thoughts and emotions were not truly their own. Yet, for all the control and rules, women still found moments of freedom in small ways. A young woman might enjoy a fleeting conversation at the market or share a joke with friends while working in the fields. A wife might find quiet satisfaction in her own small victories, like managing the household well or teaching her children values that went beyond blind obedience. These moments were not loud or rebellious, but they were real, and they helped women maintain a sense of self in a world that often sought to erase them. Some women, especially those in religious communities, found ways to carve out a life that gave them more freedom than marriage could offer. Convents were both strict and liberating. On one hand, nuns lived under clear rules of obedience and prayer, but on the other, they often had more opportunities for learning and independence than married women. A nun could read, write, and manage the affairs of her convent, things that many wives and daughters were never allowed to do. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, composers, and spiritual leaders show how some women used the church's own structure to create a life of influence. Still, not all women had the chance to choose this path. For many, life was a constant balancing act between fulfilling duties and holding on to personal dignity. They learned how to navigate contradictions of a system that both praised them as virtuous mothers and scolded them for any hint of independence. The church's teachings about sin and purity were strict, but they were also inconsistent, leaving women unsure of how to live without stepping on some invisible line. Imagine, for a moment, a woman sitting by the fire after a long day of work. She might be spinning wool or preparing a meal, her mind turning over the events of the day. Did she say too much to the merchant in the market? Did her neighbor see her smile at the young man who delivered the grain? She wonders if these simple interactions will be twisted into something untrue. Perhaps she will confess them just to be safe, though she knows they were innocent. This constant self-questioning becomes a quiet burden, shaping how she walks, how she speaks, and how she carries herself in every moment. The church often reminded women that their role was to serve others, their husbands, their children, and their community. But this service was rarely acknowledged or celebrated. Women worked endlessly from dawn until nightfall, managing households, raising children, and contributing to the survival of their families. Their labor was essential, yet it was treated as an expected duty rather than an accomplishment. The teachings of the church sometimes made this even harder, telling women that suffering and self-sacrifice were holy, that their struggles were a form of devotion. Yet history shows us that women were not as powerless as these rules might suggest. Even within strict boundaries, they found ways to shape their lives. Some women learned how to influence their husbands' decisions, using quiet persuasion rather than open confrontation. Others managed family businesses while their husbands were away, showing that they were capable leaders, despite the belief that women were unfit for such roles. Their strength was often hidden, but it was there, woven into the everyday fabric of life. As we look back on this time, we can't help but wonder how many women silently resisted the church's control, how many questioned the teachings they were given, even if they never dared speak those thoughts aloud. The traces of their resistance are faint, but they exist in the letters, the songs, the folk tales, and the traditions that survive. The deeper you look into medieval life, the more you see how the church's influence was not only public, but also deeply personal, reaching into the private thoughts and daily rhythms of women's lives. Every aspect of life was framed around religious rules: when to work, when to rest, what to eat, and even how to think about family and marriage. For women, this meant living under a constant expectation of virtue, with the church's teachings acting as both a guide and a form of control. Priests often gave detailed instructions to couples about what was acceptable in marriage. While men could sometimes bend the rules without consequence, women were constantly reminded that they were the guardians of purity and morality. They were expected to remain modest and selfless, to obey their husbands as they would obey God, and to avoid any behavior that might be considered indulgent or prideful. Even within marriage, a woman's feelings were often dismissed as unimportant. She was told her primary role was to bear children and serve her family, not to seek personal fulfillment. In some cases, the church even set rules about when a married couple could be together. There were restrictions during Lent, Advent, and other holy seasons. Certain days of the week were off limits, and there were guidelines for what was considered proper conduct. These rules were presented as necessary for spiritual purity, but they also reinforced the idea that a woman's personal feelings were secondary to religious duty. Imagine being a young wife who barely knew her husband, trying to navigate these rules while also learning how to be part of his household. There was little space for affection or tenderness, when everything was bound by obligation and fear of judgment. For unmarried women, the scrutiny was even greater. A single woman who was seen spending too much time with a man, even in innocent conversation, could find herself the subject of gossip. Her reputation could be damaged in a matter of hours, and once her reputation was tarnished, it was almost impossible to restore. This fear of being judged pushed women to live quietly, always aware of who might be watching and what others might say. Confession added another layer of tension. Women were encouraged to reveal their thoughts and actions to priests, but this was not always a comforting experience. Priests were often strict, asking probing questions and reminding women of the importance of remaining pure and obedient. Some women may have found relief in confession, using it as a way to unburden themselves. But for others, it was simply another reminder of the control the church held over their lives. It reinforced the feeling that their private thoughts and emotions were not truly their own. Yet, for all the control and rules, women still found moments of freedom in small ways. A young woman might enjoy a fleeting conversation at the market or share a joke with friends while working in the fields. A wife might find quiet satisfaction in her own small victories, like managing the household well or teaching her children values that went beyond blind obedience. These moments were not loud or rebellious, but they were real, and they helped women maintain a sense of self in a world that often sought to erase them. Some women, especially those in religious communities, found ways to carve out a life that gave them more freedom than marriage could offer. Convents were both strict and liberating. On one hand, nuns lived under clear rules of obedience and prayer, but on the other, they often had more opportunities for learning and independence than married women. A nun could read, write, and manage the affairs of her convent, things that many wives and daughters were never allowed to do. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, composers, and spiritual leaders show how some women used the church's own structure to create a life of influence. Still, not all women had the chance to choose this path. For many, Life was a constant balancing act between fulfilling duties and holding on to personal dignity. They learned how to navigate contradictions of a system that both praised them as virtuous mothers and scolded them for any hint of independence. The church's teachings about sin and purity were strict, but they were also inconsistent, leaving women unsure of how to live without stepping on some invisible line. Imagine, for a moment, a woman sitting by the fire after a long day of work. She might be spinning wool or preparing a meal, her mind turning over the events of the day. Did she say too much to the merchant in the market? Did her neighbor see her smile at the young man who delivered the grain? She wonders if these simple interactions will be twisted into something untrue. Perhaps she will confess them just to be safe, though she knows they were innocent. This constant self-questioning becomes a quiet burden, shaping how she walks, how she speaks, and how she carries herself in every moment. The church often reminded women that their role was to serve others, their husbands, their children, their community. But this service was rarely acknowledged or celebrated. Women worked endlessly from dawn until nightfall, managing households, raising children, and contributing to the survival of their families. Their labor was essential, yet it was treated as an expected duty rather than an accomplishment. The teachings of the church sometimes made this even harder, telling women that suffering and self-sacrifice were holy, that their struggles were a form of devotion. Yet history shows us that women were not as powerless as these rules might suggest. Even within strict boundaries, they found ways to shape their lives. Some women learned how to influence their husbands' decisions, using quiet persuasion rather than open confrontation. Others managed family businesses while their husbands were away, showing that they were capable leaders, despite the belief that women were unfit for such roles. Their strength was often hidden, but it was there, woven into the everyday fabric of life. As we look back on this time, we can't help but wonder how many women silently resisted the church's control, how many questioned the teachings they were given, even if they never dared speak those thoughts aloud. The traces of their resistance are faint, but they exist in the letters, the songs, the folk tales, and the traditions that survived in the bustling cities of medieval Europe, where trade routes brought merchants, nobles, and travelers from across continents. There existed a world that was both alluring and dangerous, a world inhabited by courtesans. These women lived on the edges of respectability, walking a fine line between admiration and scorn. They were both sought after and condemned, celebrated for their beauty, wit, and influence, yet judged harshly by the very societies that depended on them for entertainment and companionship. To step into the life of a courtesan was to enter a world filled with contradictions. On one hand, courtesans were often more educated and worldly than many noblewomen. They learned how to converse intelligently and how to play music, dance, or even write poetry. They understood the politics of courts and cities, navigating them with charm and precision. A successful courtesan could earn more wealth and independence than most women of her time. Yet, on the other hand, she was always at risk of falling out of favor, risk of being shamed, and risk of losing everything if her patrons withdrew their support. Imagine a medieval city like Venice or Paris. The streets are crowded with merchants selling spices, silks, and rare goods brought from distant lands. Wealthy men gather in grand halls or private chambers, seeking entertainment and conversation. It is here that courtesans make their presence felt, dressed in fabrics far finer than those of ordinary women, wearing jewelry that catches the candlelight. They stand out as figures of both fascination and suspicion. Every detail of their appearance is carefully chosen, from the way they braid their hair to the way they smile at a passing nobleman. Courtesans were not the same as women who lived in poverty or worked in brothels. While both groups were judged harshly, courtesans operated in a separate sphere, one that relied heavily on intelligence, skill, and social strategy. They built relationships with powerful men, offering not only companionship, but also conversation and art. These relationships could open doors to wealth, influence, and protection, but they could also collapse without warning. For many courtesans, the path into this life began with hardship. Some were the daughters of poor families, who saw no other way to survive. Others were widows, or women who had been cast out of traditional roles, left with few choices. Yet some women chose this life because it offered something rare in the Middle Ages: a measure of control over their destiny. While noble women were often confined by arranged marriages and strict codes of behavior, courtesans had the freedom to negotiate their relationships and to build a life based on their abilities. But freedom came with a price. Society never allowed courtesans to forget that they lived outside the boundaries of respectability. The church condemned them. Sermons warning of the dangers they posed to morality and virtue. Priests preached that women like them were temptations sent to lead men astray, symbols of sin in human form. Yet, ironically, some of the same men who listened to these sermons would seek out courtesans in secret, offering gifts and wealth in exchange for their company. The life of a courtesan was one of constant performance. Every word, every gesture, every glance was calculated. They learned how to read people, how to sense a man's mood, and how to make him feel important. In many ways, they were like actors on a stage. Their lives a series of carefully crafted scenes, meant to please and captivate. But behind the charm and laughter, there was always the awareness that one mistake, a careless word, a misplaced favor could end their career and reputation. Some courtesans rose to great heights, becoming known not just in their city, but across Europe. They became muses for artists, patrons of musicians, and even advisors to powerful men. These women left behind traces of their influence in the form of letters, paintings, and poetry. Yet even the most successful courtesan knew that her position was fragile. A single scandal could destroy everything she had built. For those who were less fortunate, the life of a courtesan could be brutal. Without wealth or powerful patrons, a woman could quickly find herself cast aside, struggling to survive in a world that offered little mercy to those who fell out of favor. It was a life of constant uncertainty, a balancing act between charm and survival. Still, there was something undeniably fascinating about these women. They defied the expectations of their time, living lives that were not confined to kitchens or They mastered the arts of conversation, music, and style, and they did so in a society that often sought to silence women's voices. Though they were judged and condemned, they carved out spaces where they could live with a degree of independence rare for their era. One can imagine the scene. A grand chamber lit by the soft glow of candlelight, where a courtesan sits at a table surrounded by wealthy men and artists. She listens intently, offering witty remarks to make the group laugh. Her dress shimmers with embroidered threads, her hair arranged with careful precision. For a moment, she holds the room's attention completely, her presence both commanding and delicate. It is in moments like this that courtesans found their power not through force, but through intelligence, skill, and the ability to captivate. But what did these women truly think behind the painted smiles and polite conversation? Did they feel trapped by the very life that gave them independence? Did they long for the kind of simple, quiet life that other women lived? Or did they see themselves as fortunate for being free from the confines of arranged marriages and domestic drudgery? We may never know their private thoughts, but their lives raise questions that remain relevant today. How much freedom can a woman have when her value is tied to how others perceive her? The daily life of a courtesan was a delicate balance between maintaining appearances and carefully managing relationships. Unlike many women of her time, she had to be more than just beautiful. She needed to be clever, quick-witted, and adaptable. Her world was not the simple rhythm of tending fields or managing a household. It was a constant dance of conversation, observation, and subtle negotiation. Courtesans were expected to entertain not only with their looks, but also with their intellect. They learned how to hold the attention of scholars, nobles, and merchants, adapting their tone to suit whoever sat across the table from them. Each day, a courtesan's routine involved preparation. She would spend hours arranging her hair, selecting garments that showed elegance without crossing into vulgarity, and preparing herself mentally for the company she would keep. The choice of fabric, color, and jewelry could send signals about her mood or status. In wealthy cities like Florence or Venice, a courtesan's wardrobe was a silent display of her success, reflecting not only her personal taste, but also the generosity of her patrons. It was said that a successful courtesan's gown could cost more than the yearly earnings of a skilled craftsman. But clothing alone was not enough to maintain her place. A courtesan needed to know how to converse about current events, art, and politics. Many of them were more educated than noble women, who were often kept from formal learning. Some learned to read and write poetry. Others learned music or dance. They cultivated an image of sophistication, which appealed to men who wanted more than just physical beauty. A conversation with a courtesan was meant to feel like an escape into a world of charm, laughter, and inside a world far removed from the rigid duties of courtly or domestic life. Yet, beneath this polished image, there was always an undercurrent of vulnerability. A courtesan's livelihood depended on the favor of wealthy men, and that favor could shift overnight. A man who once showered her with gifts could suddenly withdraw his support, leaving her with little to fall back on. Rivalries among courtesans were common, as each woman vied for the attention of patrons who were fickle and often more interested in novelty. It was not unusual for a courtesan to spend as much energy protecting her position as she did gaining it in the first place. Despite this constant tension, many courtesans managed to carve out spaces of independence. Unlike most women of their time, they could choose, to some extent, which men they entertained and how they built their social circles. Some even accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably on their own, without relying on marriage. This level of autonomy was virtually unheard of for women in medieval Europe, where most lives were dictated by fathers, husbands, or religious authorities. Still, the shadow of judgment was never far away. The church condemned courtesans, warning that they were temptations sent to corrupt men and families. Preachers spoke of them as symbols of sin, often ignoring the hypocrisy of wealthy men who sought out their company in private. This double standard was deeply entrenched, and courtesans had to be careful not to become targets of public scorn. In some cities, authorities attempted to regulate their lives, confining them to certain districts or requiring them to wear distinctive clothing to mark their profession. These measures were meant to control and humiliate them, but they also inadvertently drew attention to their unique status. There was a strange duality in how courtesans were perceived. On one hand, they were treated as outcasts, women who lived outside the boundaries of respectability. On the other hand, they were admired for their beauty, talent, and charm. Wealthy men would compete for their attention, showering them with gifts and flattery. Artists painted them, poets wrote verses about them, and musicians composed songs inspired by their presence. In this way, courtesans occupied a peculiar space condemned by society, yet celebrated in its art. For many, this life was not simply about pleasure or wealth, but survival. Some women entered this world because they had no other means of supporting themselves or their families. A widow with no inheritance, or a daughter born to a poor family, had limited options in a society where women were rarely allowed to work or own property. Becoming a courtesan, while risky, could offer a path to financial stability. But that stability was fragile. It could vanish with the loss of a single patron or a sudden shift in public opinion. The private life of a courtesan was likely very different from the image she presented. While she might appear confident and glamorous in public, in private she would have to manage her income carefully, save for uncertain times, and protect her reputation among those who mattered most. She had to be strategic in her relationships, balancing affection with caution, knowing that genuine love was a luxury she might never fully experience. There were moments of loneliness, too. A courtesan's life was filled with people patrons, servants, fellow entertainers, but not all those connections were real or trustworthy. Friendships could be complicated by jealousy or rivalry. Men who adored her one day might abandon her the next, and even those who cared for her could never fully erase the imbalance of power between them. This constant uncertainty must have been exhausting, and it explains why some courtesans sought to retire early, using whatever wealth they had gathered to live quietly, away from the intrigue of the city. And yet, for all the challenges, Many courtesans found ways to shape their destinies in a society that offered women very few choices. They became experts at reading people, understanding power dynamics, and using their talents to create a life for themselves. Some even became influential figures, advising powerful men or supporting artists and writers who would go on to shape the culture of their time. One can picture the scene of a courtesan, seated in a lavish room, speaking with a wealthy merchant or a nobleman. Her voice is calm and measured, her laughter light but purposeful. Behind every word is strategy, a calculation of what will keep his interest, what will encourage his generosity, and what will secure her own safety. It is a game she knows well, a game she must play every day. What we Dante often hear are the thoughts that pass through her mind in the quiet moments, when the candles were extinguished and the city fell silent. Did she feel proud of the life she had built? Or did she long for something simpler, something untouched by the expectations of men? Did she see herself as powerful, or merely surviving? These are questions history can only hint at, but they linger. When we imagine the hidden lives of women who lived outside the rules of their time, as the evening air settled over the narrow streets of a medieval city, the life of a courtesan truly began when others retreated into their homes after a long day of work. She prepared to step into the glow of candlelit rooms filled with laughter, music, and the soft clinking of goblets. Her world came alive at night, a place where merchants, nobles, poets, and travelers gathered to be entertained. She knew that every evening was a stage, and she was both the performer and the prize that everyone in the room quietly watched. The courtesan's presence was carefully constructed, a blend of elegance and mystery. She entered the room not with a loud display, but with a subtle confidence, aware of how to draw attention without seeming to demand it. Her voice was soft, yet deliberate, her words chosen with care to flatter and engage her companions. She understood that conversation was an art, and the ability to make a man feel both respected and admired was just as valuable as her appearance. A courtesan had to be more than just beautiful. She had to be captivating. These evenings often took place in richly decorated chambers or private salons, where tapestries lined the walls and the scent of spiced wine lingered in the air. Music played softly in the background, and the room buzzed with conversations about politics, trade, or the latest gossip from distant lands. It was in these gatherings that a courtesan thrived. She could speak with the intelligence of a scholar and the charm of an entertainer, moving effortlessly from one guest to another, making each feel as though they were the most important person in the room. But beneath the warmth and sparkle of these nights lay a constant awareness of risk. A courtesan's reputation was fragile, and one misstep could tarnish it beyond repair. A harsh word, a rival's jealousy, or a shift in public opinion could quickly undo years of work. A woman who was celebrated one week could find herself shunned the next. This meant that every interaction was strategic, every decision calculated. She had to know which patrons were worth her time, which alliances could bring safety, and which ones carried the seeds of danger. It was not uncommon for courtesans to keep detailed accounts of their relationships, gifts, and promises. Wealthy patrons often offered jewelry, coins, or even property in exchange for their company. But these gifts were never guaranteed to last. A single quarrel or change in fortune could leave a courtesan without support. For this reason, the most successful women learned to save and invest their earnings wisely, buy-in homes, or securing their future in ways that gave them some independence from the men who surrounded them. Still, life was not as glamorous as it might have appeared to outsiders. For every evening spent in silks and jewels, there were hours of planning, worry, and preparation. A courtesan had to maintain her appearance meticulously. Her clothing, her posture, and her demeanor all had to be flawless. If she fell ill, aged, or lost her charm, her patrons could simply move on to someone younger and more fashionable. This unspoken reality was a shadow that followed every courtesan, reminding her that her place in society was temporary and fragile. There were moments, of course, when the performance slipped away and something genuine emerged. A courtesan might share a quiet laugh with a trusted friend, or a conversation that felt real rather than real. Some formed deep bonds with their patrons, relationships that went beyond wealth or power. Yet even in these rare connections, there was an imbalance that could not be ignored. A courtesan's life depended on the choices and whims of others, and that reality made true freedom difficult to achieve. Among the most famous courtesans of medieval Europe were women who left behind letters and poems that give us a glimpse into their lives. These writings reveal a mix of pride and vulnerability. They speak of the joy of being admired and the thrill of independence, but also the loneliness of knowing that admiration could vanish overnight. These women were keenly aware of their position, neither fully accepted by polite society, nor entirely excluded from it. They lived in a liminal space, admired for their sophistication, yet condemned for the same reason. Even with these challenges, courtesans had access to worlds that other women could never enter. They conversed with artists, philosophers, and politicians, sometimes influencing their ideas and decisions. In cities like Venice, courtesans were known to support painters and writers, becoming silent patrons of the arts. They understood that charm could be as powerful as wealth or status, and they used it to create their own kind of legacy. But when the music faded and the guests departed, a courtesan often returned to a much quieter reality. Alone in her chambers, she might remove her jewelry and fine clothing, sit by the dim light of a candle, and count the coins and gifts she had received that evening. She would think about which patrons could be trusted, which friendships might help her, and how to prepare for the coming days. Beneath the glamour, her life was one of careful planning and constant vigilance. There is a certain tragedy in the life of a courtesan, not because it lacked beauty or joy, but because it was always balanced on a knife's edge. Every success carried the risk of failure, and every moment of freedom was shadowed by the knowledge that society would never fully accept her. And yet, these women were remarkable for their resilience. They lived with courage in a world that offered women very few paths to independence. They carved out their own lives, even if they had to do so in ways that others judged harshly. As we think about their lives, we are left with lingering questions. Did they feel powerful, knowing they could hold the attention of kings and nobles? Or did they feel trapped in a life that required constant performance? Did they dream of something simpler, something quieter? Or did they see their role as a rare chance to live beyond the limits that constrained most women of their time? In the medieval world, a woman's identity was often defined by her relationship to a man, first as a daughter, then as a wife, and possibly later as a widow. For most women, marriage was not about personal choice or love, but about alliances, survival, and duty. A wife was expected to be obedient, devoted, and modest, and her life was shaped by the expectations of her husband, family, and the church. Yet beneath these layers of duty and control were the quiet, untold stories of women who longed for something. More women who lived with desires, affections, and choices that were considered forbidden. The role of a medieval wife was demanding, both physically and emotionally. From dawn until dusk, she managed the household, cooked meals, spun wool, cared for children, and supported her husband's work. Even women of wealth and nobility were not spared from constant responsibility, though their tasks were different. A noble woman might oversee estates, direct servants, and ensure that her household ran smoothly, while also navigating the complex politics of her husband's family and alliances. But regardless of class, the same rule applied. A wife's duty was to her husband, and her loyalty was not just expected but enforced. Marriage was often arranged by families, long before the woman herself had any say in the matter. Parents considered dowries, land, and political advantages, rarely thinking about whether the bride and groom would even like each other. For a young woman, this meant that marriage could feel more like a transaction than a union. Love, if it came at all, often developed only after years of shared life, and many marriages never reached that stage. In such an environment, it is not surprising that women sometimes looked for connection elsewhere, though doing so came with dangerous consequences. Forbidden relationships were perhaps the greatest threat to a woman's reputation and survival. For a wife, even the hint of infidelity could lead to severe punishment. gossip alone could ruin her, making her the target of ridicule and suspicion. Unlike men, who often escape judgment for similar behavior, women bore the full weight of blame. A husband could accuse his wife of wrongdoing, and her word might count for nothing in the face of his claim. In some regions, a woman accused of unfaithfulness could face public humiliation, be cast out of her home, or even be subjected to legal punishment. And yet, despite the risks, love and desire were not feelings that could be completely suppressed. Some women, trapped in loveless or abusive marriages, found secret ways to express their hearts. These relationships, hidden in the shadows of society, were as fragile as they were dangerous. A single letter discovered, a single witness to a quiet conversation, could bring everything crashing down. The stakes were high, but so were the emotions that drove women to take such risks. Widows occupied a unique position in medieval society. On one hand, widowhood brought grief and uncertainty, especially if the woman had children to care for and little financial support. On the other hand, it was often the first time a woman had any real independence. A widow could manage her own household, own property in some regions, and even make decisions about her future without a man's permission. This newfound freedom, however, came with its own challenges. Widows were often pressured to remarry quickly, especially if they were young and of childbearing age. Society viewed an unmarried woman, even a widow, with suspicion, as though her independence was somehow dangerous or improper. There were, of course, widows who chose to remain single, managing their affairs with confidence and strength. Some became skilled businesswomen, running inns, trading goods, or managing estates. But even they were not free from gossip. A successful widow could be admired for her resourcefulness one day and accused of inappropriate behavior the next, simply because she did not fit the narrow mold of what a woman was expected to be. The stories of wives and widows also reveal the complicated nature of medieval relationships. Not all marriages were loveless. There are letters and records of genuine affection between husbands and wives, of shared laughter and trust that grew over years of partnership. But for every story of a happy union, there were many more of women who endured difficult lives in silence, their personal feelings overshadowed by duty and obligation. The forbidden relationships of the time, whether romantic affairs or friendships that defied social norms, were often hidden from view, but they left traces in the form of poems, songs, and whispered tales. Troubadours sang of unattainable loves, often inspired by noble women who could never openly return their affections. These songs were not just entertainment. They were reflections of the longing and frustration that many women felt but could not express. Imagine a noblewoman standing on the balcony of her castle, looking out over the fields below. She has just finished another day of managing the household and listening to the endless demands of her family. Her husband is away at war, or perhaps he is nearby but distant, concerned only with politics or wealth. She hears the distant melody of a song, carried by a traveling musician, and for a brief moment she allows herself to imagine a different life, a life where she could choose whom to love, where her heart was not confined by duty or fear. These fleeting moments of imagination were sometimes the only escape for women whose lives were tightly controlled. They might have shared these thoughts with a trusted friend, a servant, or a sister, but more often they kept them locked inside, knowing the cost of speaking too freely. A single rumor could undo years of carefully maintained respectability. The tension between duty and desire was a constant thread running through the lives of wives and widows alike. For a married woman, her reputation was tied not only to her own actions, but also to her husband's honor. For a widow, every choice she made, whether to remarry, to remain single, or to run her own household, was scrutinized. And yet, despite the weight of judgment, many women found ways to carve out small moments of freedom, moments when they could be themselves, if only for a short while. In the quiet corners of medieval life, the lives of wives and widows were full of subtle negotiations, whispered conversations, and unspoken truths. A wife might appear dutiful in public, but behind closed doors, she often carried the full weight of managing her household, while trying to preserve some sense of her own identity. The role of a wife was never simple. She was expected to cook, clean, care for children, and tend to her husband's needs. But she was also responsible for upholding the moral reputation of the family. Her behavior reflected on everyone in her household, which meant that any sign of impropriety could harm not just her own standing, but that of her entire family. For many women, the marriage they entered into was a contract arranged by families with more concern for dowries and alliances than for the feelings of the bride herself. A young woman might find herself married to a man she barely knew, moving into his household and being expected to adapt instantly. The adjustment could be harsh, especially when a wife was treated more like property than a partner. In wealthier families, marriages were strategic, designed to link families of power and land, while for peasants, marriage often ensured survival through shared labor and resources. In both cases, love was rarely the first concern. This absence of choice made the lives of some wives difficult, particularly when their husbands were unkind or indifferent. It was not unusual for a man to see his wife as a means to an heir or as part of his household management, rather than as a companion. While there are records of affectionate couples, the lack of agency for women meant that their personal happiness often came second to duty. A wife who sought comfort or companionship elsewhere risked not only her reputation. In small villages, gossip was an ever-present danger. Neighbors watched closely, and even the smallest interaction could become a source of scandal. A woman seen speaking to another man, even about something as simple as the price of grain, could quickly find herself at the center of harmful rumors. This constant surveillance made it nearly impossible for a woman to form friendships or connections without fear of being misinterpreted. The weight of public opinion was crushing, and it often forced women to live carefully, hiding their true feelings. Widows, while free of the control of a husband, faced challenges of their own. On the surface, widowhood could provide a rare form of independence. A widow could manage her own property, run a business, or make decisions for her children. For the first time in her life, she might have the freedom to shape her own future. But that freedom came with its own set of burdens. A young widow, especially one with some wealth or land, was often pressured to remarry quickly. Families and communities were suspicious of women living on their own, as though independence itself was a sign of impropriety. Those who chose not to remarry sometimes faced harsher scrutiny. A widow who remained single for too long might be seen as selfish or unnatural. If she managed her household successfully, whispers might begin that she had done so through deceitful means. Her strength, rather than being celebrated, could be twisted into something threatening. Society's rules left little room for a woman to simply live on her own terms. Yet, there were widows who thrived despite the obstacles. Some became skilled traders or landowners, building small empires of their own within the limits of their communities. There are records of widows in medieval towns running successful taverns, lending money, or taking charge of farms. These women were often both admired and feared, as they stood apart from the typical expectations of female life. Still, even they were not immune to criticism, and one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. Forbidden relationships, whether for wives or widows, were fraught with danger, but also with a kind of irresistible allure. In a society where personal choice was limited, love and affection could feel like acts of rebellion. A wife trapped in a cold marriage might find herself drawn to someone who treated her with kindness, even if she knew the risks were enormous. A widow might form a relationship that defied the expectations of her family, choosing companionship over social approval. These quiet acts of defiance rarely made it into official histories, but they existed in the spaces between songs, poems, and local legends. The stories of forbidden love often appear in the works of troubadours and poets. These singers told tales of unattainable ladies, of secret glances and hidden letters. While these stories were often romanticized, they reflected a deeper truth, that many women longed for connection in a world where they were treated as pawns in a larger game. These songs were not just entertainment, but expressions of feelings that women could rarely voice themselves. Imagine a young wife sitting by the hearth after a long day, listening to a traveling musician sing of a love that could never be. The melody stirs something in her, something she cannot name, a longing for a life where her heart, rather than her duties, could guide her choices. Perhaps she glances at her husband, busy with his tools or his drink, and wonders if he ever feels the same longing. She will never say it aloud. But in that quiet moment, the song speaks for her. Even within noble courts, where life was filled with pageantry and luxury, women often found themselves caught between duty and desire. A noblewoman's marriage was almost always arranged for political reasons, leaving little room for love. Yet, the courts were also places of intrigue, where secret affairs and quiet rebellions unfolded in shadows. A glance exchanged in a hallway, a letter slipped between the pages of a book. These were the small risks women took to feel something beyond the roles they had been given. The reality, however, was harsh. A discovered affair could lead to ruin, both for the woman and for her entire family. Punishments were often severe, ranging from public shaming to exile or imprisonment. Even a widow, who technically had more freedom, could face scandal if she chose a partner deemed unsuitable. The pressure to conform was immense, yet the human heart does not always follow rules. It is difficult to know how many women defied these expectations in quiet ways. Most of their stories are lost to history, erased by the silence that surrounded anything considered improper. But we can imagine them wives who smiled politely at their husbands, while secretly yearning for freedom, widows who refused to remarry and carved out lives of independence, and women who risked everything for a fleeting connection that made them feel alive. As the seasons changed and years passed, the lives of wives and widows were marked by cycles of duty, expectation, and quiet. And a married woman's day might begin before dawn, stoking the fire, preparing food, and tending to children or animals. Her labor never truly ended, and while her work was the foundation of household survival, it was rarely celebrated. Her value was measured not by her happiness or intelligence, but by her obedience, her ability to keep a home, and the respectability she projected to others. This pressure to maintain a perfect image extended beyond the household. A wife's reputation was intertwined with that of her husband, and any whisper of impropriety could be disastrous. Even innocent actions could be misinterpreted. A casual word exchanged with another man, a kind gesture to a neighbor, or simply being seen walking alone at the wrong time could lead to damaging gossip. In villages where everyone knew one another, such rumors spread quickly, taking on a life of their own. A woman might spend years building a reputation, only for it to crumble in a single day because of idle talk. Yet, the reality of medieval marriage was often more complex than the rules suggested. Some husbands and wives formed genuine partnerships, working side by side in the fields, or managing their households with a sense of shared responsibility. Letters from the time show rare glimpses of a family where husbands thanked their wives for their hard work or expressed longing during times of separation. But for every story of mutual respect, there were countless women trapped in marriages that were cold, controlling, or simply indifferent. In these situations, forbidden relationships, whether romantic or simply emotional, became a secret refuge. A woman might find herself drawn to a kind word from a neighbor, or a fleeting smile from someone who saw her not as a servant of duty, but as a person. These connections were dangerous, yet they offered a spark of life in an otherwise rigid existence. Most of the time, such feelings remained unspoken, hidden beneath layers of caution. But sometimes they slipped through, resulting in secret letters, quiet meetings, or simply daydreams that were never acted upon but cherished in silence. Widows had a slightly different path, though theirs was no less fraught with difficulty. Once her husband died, a woman could, for the first time, make decisions for herself. She could manage property, hire workers, and even choose whether or not to remarry. For some, this freedom was a gift. After years of living under a husband's authority, they could finally shape their own lives. But this independence was also a target for criticism. A widow who managed her household too well was sometimes accused of being cunning or manipulative. Her success might inspire envy among her neighbors, or even anger among her late husband's family, especially if money or inheritance was involved. For wealthier widows, the pressure was even greater. Suitors, both sincere and opportunistic, would appear, eager to marry not just the woman but also the lands and assets she controlled. A widow who refused to remarry was often labeled stubborn or unnatural, as if a woman could not exist without being under the authority of a man. But some widows chose to defy these expectations, living independently and building lives of their own, even if it meant facing endless rumors. The tension between love and duty is captured in the songs and poems of the time. Troubadours and poets often sang of secret romances, of women who were unattainable because they were bound by marriage or social expectation. These songs, while romanticized, reflected the reality that many women lived with feelings they could never safely express. A single love letter could be enough to ruin a woman if it fell into the wrong hands. Imagine a widow sitting by her window on a quiet evening, the house silent now that the children are asleep. She thinks of the life she had with her husband, perhaps one filled with more responsibility than affection. For the first time, she has control over her choices. She can decide how to run the household, what to spend, and whether to open her heart again. But as she looks at the flicker of candlelight on the table, she knows that every decision will be judged by others, and that freedom always comes with a cost. For some women, forbidden relationships were not about romance at all, but about friendship and trust. Women often turn to each other for emotional support, forming bonds that could be as meaningful as any romantic connection. These friendships were lifelines in a world that sought to control every aspect of their lives over shared tasks like weaving or baking. They confided in one another, offered advice, and found strength in the knowledge that they were not alone. These quiet alliances were not written into the chronicles of history, but they were powerful in their own way, helping women endure the hardships and limitations of their time. There were also moments of quiet rebellion, often so subtle they might seem invisible to outsiders. A wife might manage the household finances in ways her husband never noticed, putting aside a small stash of money for her children's future. A widow might refuse a marriage proposal from a wealthy man, choosing instead to live modestly but on her own terms. These small acts of defiance were rarely celebrated, but they were acts of survival, and despite the strict rules, life was not always joyless. Women found small pockets of happiness in the routines of daily life, a laugh shared with a friend, the satisfaction of a well-prepared meal, the beauty of a sunny day after a long winter. These moments were not recorded by historians, but they were as real as the battles and politics that filled the pages of medieval chronicles. The stories of wives and widows remind us that medieval women were not merely passive figures trapped by history. They were thinkers, caretakers, and quiet rebels. They endured difficult lives with grace and intelligence, navigating a world that rarely gave them the freedom they deserved. While their voices may be faint in the historical record, their lives still echo in the traditions, songs, and lessons they left behind. We are left with the question of how many women's stories were lost simply because they did not fit the official narrative of the time. How many wives dreamed of freedom? How many widows built lives of quiet strength, their names never written down? In a medieval village, gossip was more than idle chatter. It was a powerful force that could shape lives, reputations, and entire futures. For women, gossip was both a weapon and a danger, a social current that could carry someone to acceptance or drag her down into disgrace. With no newspapers or social media, news and rumors traveled by word of mouth and in small, tightly knit communities. This meant that every glance, every action, and every whispered word was noticed, remembered, and often repeated. Imagine a narrow street in a rural village, lined with timber-framed cottages and small gardens. Women gather at the communal well, drawing water while exchanging news of the day. A passing comment about someone's absence from church, or a remark about a new dress, might seem harmless in that moment. But as the story passes from one mouth to another, it can grow, shift, and twist into something far more damaging. By the time it reaches the ears of a priest or a husband, it may carry accusations that were never spoken outright. For women, This constant surveillance created a kind of invisible cage. A young woman who laughed too freely in public might be labeled flirtatious. A wife who spent too much time speaking with a neighbor as husband could find herself accused of being even simple acts, like choosing to wear brighter clothing or standing too confidently, could draw unwanted attention. In a world where a woman's reputation defined her worth, gossip could be devastating. It could mean losing the chance to marry, being shunned by the community, or even facing legal punishment. If the rumors were severe enough, gossip was especially dangerous because it required no proof. A single story, repeated by enough people, could be treated as fact. It didn't matter if the woman in question had done nothing wrong. The mere perception of impropriety was often enough to bring lasting harm. A woman accused of being too bold or too friendly might find herself isolated, with few friends willing to defend her. Others might avoid her, simply out of fear of being associated with her supposed behavior. The church, too, played a role in amplifying the effects of gossip. Priests often preached about the importance of a woman's virtue, warning against behavior that might tempt men or disrupt the moral fabric of the community. These sermons, though aimed at all parishioners, often made women feel as though they were under constant scrutiny. A confession booth, meant to be a place of spiritual guidance, could turn into a place where a woman was asked to explain not just her own actions, but the rumors circulating about her. In noble courts, gossip was just as dangerous, though it moved through hallways and gardens rather than village wells. A single whispered story could ruin a lady's standing, damage a marriage alliance, or alter the course of family fortunes. Courtiers were skilled at using gossip as a weapon, planting stories that would undermine rivals. For noble women, every gesture at a feast, every word spoken in a corridor, was observed by those looking for something to use against them. What made gossip so powerful was its mix of truth and fiction. It often began with something small and innocent glance, a simple act of kindness, but grew as people added their own interpretations. This ability of gossip to grow unchecked meant that a woman could never fully protect herself from it. Even the most careful and modest women were vulnerable. For women of lower classes, the stakes were different, but no less serious. A peasant woman who became the target of malicious gossip might lose her place in the community, be denied help during hard times, or see her children suffer from a damaged reputation. In extreme cases, rumors could lead to accusations of witchcraft or immorality charges that carried severe, sometimes fatal consequences. The fear of gossip shaped how women behaved. They learned to walk carefully, to speak softly, and to avoid drawing attention to themselves. It wasn't always about modesty, it was about survival. A single misinterpreted action could spiral into a story that would follow them for years. Some women avoided speaking to men outside their families altogether, while others stayed home as much as possible, to avoid being seen in situations that could be twisted into something scandalous. Yet, despite its destructive power, gossip was also a form of connection. Women shared stories with one another as a way of bonding and of passing the long hours spent working in the fields, weaving or caring for children. There was a social rhythm to these conversations, part entertainment, part warning system. News about who was marrying whom, who was sick, or who had trouble with the harvest often traveled through these same channels. Gossip wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was a way for women to share information in a society where they had few other voices. But the line between storytelling and slander was thin. A remark made in jest could become harmful by the time it reached the wrong ears. A woman who was well liked might be forgiven for small missteps, but one who was already on the fringes of social acceptance could be pushed out entirely. It was an unpredictable force, one that no woman could completely control. Imagine the quiet tension of a village where rumors have taken hold. A young woman accused of being too familiar with a traveling merchant now finds herself watched every time she steps outside her door. Neighbors stop greeting her as warmly as they once did. At the market, whispers follow her, and even those who don't believe the rumors stay silent, fearing that defending her would put them under suspicion as well. The woman herself might never know exactly what was said, but she can feel the weight of it in every glance and hushed conversation. In these moments, The damage done by gossip could feel worse than any punishment, because it was invisible yet inescapable. A reputation once tarnished was nearly impossible to restore, and women who were cast out by gossip often had no path to redemption. Some left their villages entirely, moving to new towns in hopes of starting over where no one knew their name. Others withdrew into quiet, isolated lives, hoping that silence would eventually make people forget. The fear of gossip was not just a medieval concern. It was a daily reality that shaped how women lived, spoke, and interacted with the world around them. It is easy to forget how powerful words can be when repeated over time. But for women of the Middle Ages, a few careless remarks could determine their entire future. In a medieval village where everyone knew everyone else, gossip spread faster than the toll of the church bell. It was not confined to public spaces like markets or wells. It traveled through kitchens, fields, and heartside conversations, carried on the voices of those who both feared and fed it. For women, who were constantly under the watchful eye of neighbors, gossip was a shadow they could never outrun. Every move, every word, and every glance could be interpreted and retold, often with added detail that made the original act seem far more scandalous than it had been. Consider a simple moment. A young woman walking home from the market with her basket of bread and cheese. She stops to greet a farmer she's known since childhood, exchanging a few kind words about the weather and the harvest. To an observer, this harmless interaction might appear as something more. By the time the story is told to a third person, the conversation may have become a whispered claim that she lingered too long, smiled too warmly, or behaved in a way that was improper. And once such a story takes root, it spreads like wildfire, leaving the woman to defend herself against something that never even happened. Gossip didn't just ruin reputations. It could alter the course of a woman's life. A young girl hoping to marry well might see her chances vanish if her name became entangled in rumors. A widow running a small business could lose customers if someone claimed she was dishonest or too bold. For those of lower class, where survival depended on community support, gossip could mean losing not just friends, but access to essential help in hard times. The village was both a network of protection and a stage of judgment. And once a woman was marked by gossip, it was difficult to erase the stain. Priests and church officials often used gossip as a way to reinforce moral teachings. A woman who is accused of wrongdoing might be called out in sermons, her alleged sin used as an example for others. This was not just about religion, but about maintaining control. By making women fear the whispers of their neighbors, the church ensured that they would remain cautious, quiet, and obedient. Confession, which was supposed to be private, sometimes added to the problem. A priest who heard a story might subtly share his concerns with others, creating a ripple effect that left the woman even more exposed. In noble courts, gossip was even more dangerous, though it wore a more refined mask. A misplaced glance or a casual comment could spark stories that affected entire families. Alliances and inheritances could be threatened by rumors, and noble women had to walk an especially careful line. They were often surrounded by attendants, rivals, and advisors who watched every move, ready to twist the smallest detail into a weapon. A whispered story about a lady's improper behavior could travel from one court to another, damaging her reputation far beyond her own home. For some women, the only defense against gossip was to live so quietly that there was nothing to discuss. They avoided unnecessary trips to the market, kept their heads lowered, and spoke only when necessary. But such caution could also invite suspicion. A woman who was too reserved might be accused of hiding something, while one who was too outgoing risked being seen as too bold. There was no perfect balance. Every woman was vulnerable to someone's judgment. Gossip also had a way of feeding on jealousy. If a woman was admired for her beauty, her intelligence, or her skill, others might feel threatened and start rumors to bring her down. A successful widow who managed her farm or business well might be accused of having achieved her success through dishonorable means. A young bride who was too well liked by the men of the village might find herself labeled as unfaithful, even if she had done nothing wrong. This kind of jealousy was often quiet and invisible, but it could be as sharp as any knife. There were times when gossip could be deadly. in periods of fear or crisis, as during outbreaks of disease, poor harvests, or social unrest. Communities looked for someone to blame. Women who were already on the fringes of society often became easy targets. A healer who used herbs and natural remedies could be accused of witchcraft. A widow living alone might be labeled as suspicious simply because she did not fit the mold of a respectable woman. Once these rumors began, they were almost impossible to stop, and the consequences could be fatal. Imagine the weight of living under such constant scrutiny. A woman might wake each day wondering what would be said about her by nightfall. If she laughed, would it be called flirtation? If she stayed home, would she be accused of sulking or plotting? This anxiety shaped how women moved through the world. Their gestures became smaller, their voices quieter, and their smiles more cautious. They learned to think ahead, to anticipate how each action might be perceived, not because they wanted to, but because their survival depended on it. But gossip wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was simply a way for women to share stories and keep each other informed. In a time when women had little power and few formal roles in society, these conversations were one of the few ways they could express themselves. They shared advice, news, and even warnings, passing along information that could be helpful or protective. Yet this same network of communication could quickly turn destructive when jealousy, fear, or misunderstanding took over. It is hard not to think of the women who fell victim to gossip through no fault of their own. A quiet girl who became the subject of rumors might lose her chance to marry, leaving her dependent on relatives or forced into hard labor. A wife accused of being unfaithful, even if innocent, could be beaten, cast out, or left with nothing. A widow who was too independent might face hostility from neighbors who viewed her freedom as dangerous. The consequences were harsh, and they often fell on those least able to defend themselves. And yet, some women found ways to fight back. A well-placed act of generosity, sharing food, helping a neighbor, or offering kindness could sometimes soften the sharpness of gossip. Others relied on allies, forming quiet friendships with those who would defend their name when rumors arose. These acts of solidarity were often hidden, but they could make the difference between survival and ruin. The lingering question is, how many lives were quietly destroyed by nothing more than whispered words? How many women were forced into silence, exile, or despair because of stories that were half-truths or outright lies? As night fell over the village and the fires burned low in the hearts, the echoes of gossip lingered like smoke in the air. For many women, there was no escaping it. Even in the privacy of their own homes, they felt the weight of other people's opinions pressing on them, shaping how they lived and what they dared to say or do. Gossip was not something that could be confronted head. It was an invisible force, slippery and relentless, twisting ordinary actions into something scandalous, even when no wrong had been done. For a young girl just entering adulthood, gossip was particularly dangerous. Her reputation was her most valuable asset, and one careless story could ruin her chances of making a good match in marriage. Mothers would often warn their daughters to be quiet, to walk modestly, and to avoid speaking too freely with men. A single rumor of lingering too long in conversation, of laughing too openly, of meeting someone in secret could cling to her like a stain she could never wash away. It didn't matter if the rumor was true. In the eyes of the community, perception mattered more than reality. A wife, too, had to tread carefully. Her husband's honor was tied to her behavior, and if she was seen as behaving in a way that brought shame, the consequences could be swift and harsh. In some villages, women accused of impropriety were publicly humiliated, made to stand before neighbors and endure their insults. In more severe cases, they might be beaten or cast out of their homes, left with no means of survival. Even when the accusations were false, the stain of gossip could remain for years, forcing the woman to live under a shadow of suspicion. For widows, the situation was different, but no less perilous. Without a husband to defend their honor, they were often easy targets for gossip. A widow who remained single for too long might be accused of seeking the attention of men, while one who remarried too quickly could be labeled as disloyal or greedy. A successful widow who ran her own business or managed her own land could find herself accused of dishonesty or witchcraft simply because her independence was seen as unnatural. The more a woman stood out, the more likely she was to become the focus of whispered stories. In noble courts, gossip operated on an even grander scale. It was not just about reputation, it was about power. A single rumor could destroy a marriage alliance, undermine a noble woman's standing, or even threaten the stability of entire families. Courtiers used gossip as a weapon, spreading lies or half-truths to eliminate rivals. For a lady of the court, every gesture, every word was carefully watched. A misplaced smile or a private conversation could be twisted into a scandal. And once such a story took hold, it was nearly impossible to control. What made gossip so insidious was its ability to take root in the smallest of details. A woman might simply pause to speak to a traveling merchant or exchange a few words with a knight, and suddenly stories would begin to circulate. Each person who repeated the tale added a little more detail, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unconsciously, until the original moment was unrecognizable. This constant threat of misinterpretation forced women to live with a sense of caution that must have been exhausting. Yet, for all its cruelty, gossip was also a means of connection, particularly for women. It was through these conversations that they learned about the world around them, who was getting married, who was in trouble, and who needed help. These stories were part of the fabric of daily life, offering both warnings and entertainment. Sometimes gossip served as a way to protect one another, alerting women to men who could not be trusted or to dangers in the community. But just as often, it turned against them, becoming a source of fear rather than support. To understand the power of gossip, imagine a woman sitting in her small cottage, aware that she has become the subject of whispers. She knows the story is false, but there is no clear way to fight it. If she protests too loudly, people will say she is defensive because she has something to hide. If she stays silent, her silence will be taken as guilt. No matter what she does, the story continues to spread, carried on the breath of those who claim to be only repeating what they heard. It is a battle she cannot win. There were women who learned to navigate this world of whispers with remarkable skill. Some turned the power of gossip to their advantage, spreading stories that distracted from their own lives or that cast them in a favorable light. A well-placed rumor could be used as a shield or a weapon, but it was a dangerous game, one that could backfire at any moment. Others chose a different strategy, cultivating an image of such modesty and piety that no one would dare speak ill of them. But this, too, was a form of performance, a careful act that required constant attention and control. Over time, the fear of gossip seeped into the rhythms of life. Women learned to be careful with every word, every glance, and every movement. They monitored themselves in ways that went far beyond simple politeness. It was not enough to do the right thing. They had to appear to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. This constant self-surveillance shaped how women dressed, how they interacted with neighbors, and even how they thought about themselves. And yet, despite the harm it caused, gossip could never be fully silenced. It was part of the human experience, a reflection of curiosity, jealousy, and fear. In a world without written records, for most people, stories were how communities made sense of one another, even when those stories were unkind or untrue. For women, the challenge was not just to survive the rumors, but to hold on to a sense of self in a world that often defined them by the words of others. We can only wonder how many lives were quietly shaped or shattered by nothing more than whispered conversations. How many women were forced into silence or exile because of stories that began with something as small as a glance? And how many found ways to endure, carrying themselves with grace, despite the weight of those invisible judgments? In the medieval world, love, law, and survival were all tightly intertwined for women. A woman's life was rarely her own, shaped instead by rules that dictated whom she could marry, how she must behave, and what role she would play in her family and community. While songs of the time often spoke of romance and noble devotion, the reality for most women was far more complicated. Love was not always a choice. It was often a luxury, secondary to the demands of law and social duty. Imagine a young woman living in a village or a bustling market town, her future already planned by her parents before she even reaches adulthood. Marriage was not about falling in love or choosing a partner based on affection. It was about forging alliances, gaining land, or improving the family's standing. For a noble woman, this might mean being married off to a man she had never met, perhaps one much older, or living far from her home. For a peasant girl, it might mean marrying someone who could provide a stable life, even if affection was barely part of the equation. The laws of the time gave women little say in these matters. Once married, a woman was legally tied to her husband in almost every way. She could not own property independently in many regions, and her rights were largely absorbed into his. Her voice in legal matters was limited, her testimony often considered less valuable than that of a man. A wife's duty was clear. She was expected to serve, obey, and remain faithful, regardless of whether her husband treated her with kindness or cruelty. Yet, despite these harsh realities, women still found ways to experience love and connection. Some marriages, while arranged, grew into true partnerships over time. A husband and wife might learn to respect and even care for each other as they worked together to run their household or farm. There are historical letters that speak of genuine tenderness between couples, though such cases were exceptions rather than the rule. For those who sought love outside of their assigned roles, the risks were enormous. A woman who was accused of infidelity could face severe punishment, ranging from public humiliation to being cast out of a home. The mere suggestion of improper behavior could be enough to ruin her reputation, whether or not it was true. And yet, forbidden love persisted, hidden in glances, secret letters, or brief, stolen moments that carried both joy and fear. The law was not only concerned with marriage, but also with maintaining strict social order. Women's behavior was carefully regulated, often through a combination of religious doctrine and local customs. The church played a major role in this, declaring what was acceptable and what was sinful. Women were taught to be modest, to cover their hair, and to avoid drawing any attention that might be considered inappropriate. Even within marriage, their personal feelings were expected to remain secondary to the duties of family and faith. Widows had slightly more freedom under the law, but their lives were still shaped by expectation. A widow could manage her late husband's property in some places, but her independence was often seen as temporary or suspicious. Families pressured young widows to remarry quickly, especially if they were still of childbearing age. A woman who chose to remain single risked becoming the subject of gossip, as though her independence was somehow unnatural. And yet, for some widows, this was the first time they could truly make their own choice, whether to run a business, manage land, or live quietly on their own terms. Love was complicated even for noble women who lived in castles surrounded by luxury. While they might have had fine clothing and servants, their marriages were often political arrangements. Courtly love, the highly romanticized ideal sung about by troubadours and poets, was rarely the reality. A noble woman might become the object of a knight's admiration, but such feelings were often expressed only in songs or poems, not in real-life relationships. Acting on such emotions was dangerous, not just for the woman but for her entire family, as it could jeopardize alliances or bring shame. For women of lower classes, survival often came before love. Life was physically demanding, filled with long days of labor. A peasant woman might marry for practical reasons because the man could share the work of tending animals, planting crops, and ensuring there was enough food to last the winter. Love, if it developed, was a quiet, gradual thing, built on shared hardships rather than grand gestures. Still, the human heart is rarely bound by rules, and even in the strictest times, women found ways to express affection and hope. A wife might hide a small token or a flower given by someone she cared for, cherishing it in secret. A widow might refuse to remarry not because she had no suitors, but because she valued her newfound independence and cherished her memories. These quiet acts, though invisible to official records, speak of resilience and a determination to find meaning in life beyond the roles society imposed. we are left wondering how many stories of love and survival have been lost to time, never written down because they belonged to women whose voices were not considered worth preserving. How many lives were shaped by laws that valued property and power over personal happiness? How many women dared to dream of something more, even if they could never fully grasp it? The laws that governed medieval life were often harsh and unyielding, especially for women. A woman's life was shaped by rules that extended far beyond her control, with legal codes that treated her as property rather than as an individual with her rights and desires. These laws were reinforced by custom and by the teachings of the church, creating a world where a woman's worth was often measured not by her intelligence or capability, but by her obedience, chastity, and ability to bear children. Marriage contracts were not just personal unions, but legal arrangements. A young woman could be married off to secure a piece of land, a political alliance, or even peace between two rival families. Her consent was often irrelevant. Fathers, brothers, or guardians made these decisions, treating marriage as a form of business transaction. For many women, their wedding day was not a celebration of love, but a moment of resignation, stepping into a future chosen for them by others. Once married, a woman's life was bound by her husband's authority. In many places, she could not own property in her name or make significant decisions without his permission. If she were mistreated or neglected, there was little legal recourse. Divorce, as we think of it today, was nearly impossible, and separation was rare, reserved for extraordinary cases, and only granted under the scrutiny of the church. Even then, a woman often bore the blame for a failed marriage, regardless of the circumstances. Despite these constraints, women found ways to adapt and endure. Many wives managed the day-to-day operations of their households, especially when their husbands were away for long periods due to trade, war, or other obligations. A capable wife could oversee the farm, manage servants, and even handle accounts, all while raising children and maintaining the home. While these responsibilities were demanding, they also gave women a quiet power, a chance to show their strength in ways that were often invisible but vital to their family's survival. For widows, the law provided a narrow but important window of opportunity. A widow could inherit her husband's property or business, and for the first time in her life, she might have real control over her affairs. Some widows became skilled landowners, merchants, or innkeepers, running their enterprises with efficiency and success. But this independence often drew suspicion. A widow who thrived without remarrying might be viewed as, and whispers about her improper behavior could circulate. Society seemed to struggle with the idea of a woman who could manage without the protection of a man. Love, when it existed, had to find its place between these rigid laws and expectations. Couples who truly cared for each other often did so quietly, without the grand displays of romance we might imagine today. Love was built slowly, through shared work and mutual respect, rather than through sudden passion. In peasant households, a husband and wife might grow closer over the years as they faced hardships together, harsh winters, poor harvests, or the challenge of raising children with limited resources. Their affection was practical, grounded in survival, but it was no less real for being understated. For noble women, love was even more complicated. They were often married off as part of political arrangements, their personal feelings irrelevant to the plans of their families. A young noblewoman might be sent to live in a castle far from her childhood home, surrounded by strangers, and expected to immediately take on the role of wife, hostess, and mother. If she developed feelings for someone outside her marriage, those feelings had to be hidden carefully, as even the suspicion of impropriety could lead to scandal or ruin. The concept of courtly love, so often romanticized in poetry and song, was largely a Fantasian, idealized version of affection that rarely translated into real life. Troubadours sang of knights who adored noble ladies from afar, but these stories were symbolic, meant to celebrate virtue and honor rather than actual romance. A noblewoman might enjoy the flattery of a poet's song, but she knew that any real relationship outside of her marriage would be dangerous, both for her and for her family. The law also dictated how women could interact with men outside their households. Unmarried women were expected to remain chaste until marriage, and even the hint of impropriety could destroy their chances of making a good match. Parents were vigilant about their daughters' behavior, keeping them under close watch to ensure that no rumor could tarnish their reputation. In some regions, unmarried women were even required to have chaperones when in public, a practice that reinforced the idea that they were fragile and needed constant supervision. Despite these barriers, women were not without they developed quiet strategies to navigate the expectations placed upon them. Some learned to use their influence over household affairs to their advantage, shaping decisions about money, land, or family matters. Others relied on subtle alliances with other women mothers, sisters, or friends who offered advice and support. These networks of trust were crucial, helping women endure lives that were often defined by duty rather than personal freedom. Even love, when forbidden, found its way into these hidden corners. A glance shared across a marketplace, a secret letter delivered by a trusted servant, a fleeting touch exchanged in a crowded hall. These were the small moments that gave life a spark of meaning. These gestures might not have changed a woman's fate, but they offered her a sense of connection, a reminder that she was more than just a wife, daughter, or widow. As we look back, we can only imagine how many women lived lives filled with silent strength, balancing their hearts against the heavy weight of law and tradition. How many of them dared to dream of love in a world where survival often came first? And how many of their stories remain untold, buried in the shadows of history, because they were deemed unimportant by those who recorded the past? The balance between love, law, and survival defined nearly every stage of a medieval woman's life. It was not simply a question of what she wanted, but of what was allowed, expected, or demanded by the structures around her. For many women, survival meant following rules that were not of their own making, and love, if it appeared at all, was often something private, fragile, and hidden beneath layers of duty. In villages, the concept of love was frequently overshadowed by the need to endure harsh conditions. Most peasant families lived on the edge of poverty, their lives ruled by the rhythm of the seasons and the struggle to produce enough food to last through winter. A marriage, therefore, was less about romance and more about partnership, about finding someone who could share the workload of tending animals, harvesting crops, and maintaining a home. Affection could develop over time, but it was built slowly through shared hardships and the quiet comfort of working side by side. For these women, survival itself became a kind of love, a bond forged by mutual effort rather than by grand declarations. But even in these simpler communities, laws shaped everything. A woman's legal rights were limited, and her life could be dictated by her husband's decisions. A wife might work the land all day, yet have no claim to the fruits of her labor. She could not easily leave a marriage, even if it was cruel, and her role as a mother or caretaker was treated as both obligation and expectation. The law treated her as a part of her husband's household, often leaving her with little room to make decisions for herself. Widows faced a different set of challenges, and for some, widowhood offered both risk and opportunity. Without a husband, a widow could step into a position of authority that was otherwise denied to married women. She might manage property, negotiate trades, or oversee workers, becoming a respected figure in her community. But this independence often brought suspicion. A woman who no longer had a man to control her was seen as unpredictable or even threatening. Jealous neighbors might start rumors, suggesting that she was too proud, too wealthy, or too free with her behavior. And if the widow resisted pressure to remarry, those whispers often grew louder. In towns and cities, the laws governing women's lives were more complicated, shaped not only by local customs, but also by the powerful influence of the church. The church's teachings about love were deeply moral. Women were warned that desire outside of marriage was sinful, while within marriage, they were reminded that their role was to serve their husbands. Any expression of independence or personal longing was treated as something to be confessed and forgiven rather than celebrated. For noble women, the stakes were higher. Their marriages were not merely personal contracts, but political tools, arranged to secure alliances, strengthen family power, or gain wealth. A noble woman might find herself married to a man many years older, a stranger she had never spoken to before her wedding day. Once married, she was expected to be the ideal lady of the castle, obedient and fertile, producing heirs to continue her husband's line. Her personal feelings were of little concern to anyone, yet even in these highly structured lives, love found ways to surface. There are stories of noble couples who grew to respect and care for each other, their bonds strengthened by the challenges of courtly life. Letters from medieval times reveal glimpses of tenderness, a husband writing to his wife while away at war, thanking her for her prayers and support. A wife sending small tokens to remind her husband of home. These moments, while rare, show that even in arranged marriages, genuine affection could grow, though it was often a slow and unspoken process. But there were also women who longed for something beyond duty. The poetry of courtly love, popular in noble circles, reflects this yearning. Troubadours sang of ladies who were admired from afar, of knights who dedicated their lives to the service of a woman they could never truly have. While these songs were often symbolic, they hinted at real emotions, at the quiet desires and frustrations of women who were expected to suppress their feelings. For some, these stories of unattainable love were both a comfort and a reminder of the life they could never lead. The law did not just govern marriage. It also dictated punishment for women who were accused of breaking the rules of love and fidelity. A wife suspected of infidelity might face public humiliation or worse. Her husband could dismiss her, and she might be left with nothing, not even her children. In some regions, the penalties were brutal, including physical punishment or imprisonment. A man's reputation could survive scandal, but a woman's almost never could. This constant threat meant that many women lived with a quiet fear of being misunderstood. A friendly conversation with a man could lead to rumors. A smile might be misread as something inappropriate. Women learned to guard their words and their actions, always aware of how they might be perceived by others. This vigilance shaped their daily lives, influencing how they dressed, how they moved, and even how they expressed joy. Despite all of this, women endured. They found strength in one another, in the bonds of friendship and family. Mothers taught daughters how to navigate the complex web of expectations, offering advice that mixed caution with resilience. Sisters and friends shared stories, laughter, and secrets in quiet spaces where judgment could not reach them. In these moments, love, whether romantic or not, was a source of survival. When we think about love, law, and survival in the medieval era, it's tempting to see the rules and hardships as out. But the truth is that women were never simply defined by these limits. They were resourceful and clever, finding ways to live full lives despite the constraints. A glance exchanged in a market, a letter carefully hidden, a small act of kindness, these were acts of quiet rebellion against a world that often told them to remain invisible. We're left wondering how many of these stories remain untold. How many women loved deeply, but in ways that history never recorded? How many chose survival over passion, knowing that the price of following their hearts would be too high? And how many, in their quiet moments, dreamed of a world where love and freedom were not at odds with each other?